Well, who I am is Irving Perlmutter, middle initial H for Harold. I came originally from New York City. I'm a graduate of Columbia University. I was accepted at Yale Law School for the class of 1954, and that brought me to New Haven. I married a woman from New Haven, Marcia Lipkin. I was widowed 8 years ago, and we were married for 52 years. And we had 3 children, and she was the loveliest person I've ever known, except for her mother, my mother-in-law. I was fortunate. People say that, you're lucky if you have one mother. I had 2, my own mother and my mother-in-law.
Isn't that great?
I was admitted to the practice of law on July 27, 1954, and I went into the service right after that. Served 2 years. When I came back, I went to work for Ed Horowitz, who was the clerk of the Superior Court in New Haven. I worked for him for 2 years. Then I was a partner of a firm called Lander, Markle, Greenfield, and Crick. Lander was Harry Lander, who was a member of the Connecticut Bar from 1926. Jim Greenfield, who was still alive, and he's about 88 now. He retired from the practice of law. Arnie Markle was state's attorney until he died in 1961. Arnold was he died in the course of not running a marathon, but he was a runner, and he collapsed. And he and Jack Zeldis, who practiced law in Bridgeport, were best friends. And John Crick, of course, is still alive, and he's practicing law, I believe, with a firm in Hamden.
That firm eventually became Greenfield, Crick and Jacobs, right?
That's right. At the event, but I had left by that time. I left that firm in 1961, and I became assistant U.S. attorney. For a short time, I had practiced with Fred and Ben Morse independently, but I was appointed assistant U.S. attorney October 31st, 1961, and we had a great office. Bob Zampano was the U.S. attorney. Arnold Markle was the assistant. Jim O'Connor, who was Tom Dodd's administrative assistant, was up in Hartford. He was my best friend. And John Adams was the 4th. The 4 of us and Bob Zampano covered the entire state. Now I think they have something like 60 or 80 assistants. But I thought we were the best law firm that was ever created. It was just fun practicing. The 2 or 3 years that I was there, I had the most fun practicing ever in my entire life.
Tell us a little bit about Bob Zampano.
Bob Zampano was class of 1954 at Yale Law School. We were classmates. Bob Zampano was, when he graduated, he was the law clerk for Judge Robert Anderson, who was an absolutely marvelous person. Judge Anderson was really a World War II hero. He was a lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard. He lived in Noank, and he came from a family that had been in the Noank area probably from the 1700s. He had been public defender. This is Judge Anderson. He had been public defender. Then he had been state's attorney for about 18 years. And then he was appointed United States District Judge. And he was just one of the most marvelous people I've ever known. There was an old clerk by the name of I think it was William Beers, at the U.S. District Court. And he was there like from revolutionary times, from the times of the Revolution. And Judge Anderson used to tell this story about himself. He used to say, I thought I was pretty good, public defender, state's attorney for 18 years, U.S. District Judge. I thought I was pretty good. And I had my first motion calendar. That's like the Superior Court short calendar. And he brought a secretary from private practice, and the clerk came in, and Judge Anderson thought he had done a pretty good job. And Beers asked his secretary, "How did the lad do?" Here he is. Here I am. I'm a U.S. District Judge, and the clerk is saying, clerk was, I guess, must have been in his 80s. He says, "How did the lad do?" Anyway, and at the time I was appointed, there was Tom Dodd and the Republicans had made an agreement. They were going to.
Just for the record, you'd let those people who may not be familiar with Tom Dodd.
Tom Dodd was the United States Senator, and his former law partner was M. Joseph Blumenfeld, and he wanted him to become a district judge, a district court judge. And the Republicans wanted William Timbers from Fairfield County, who they wanted him to be a judge. And Timbers had kind of a, I won't say, I can't speak to the checkered reputation, but it was clear that Tom Dodd did not like William Timbers. And he said, as long as as long as I have what's called senatorial courtesy, I'm never going to approve William Timbers. Well, the other senator was Prescott Bush, who was George H.W. Bush's father. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, on the last day of the Senate session, Senators Dodd and Bush walked down arm in arm and placed the nomination for United States District Judge William Timbers and M. Joseph Blumenfeld. But John Bailey also he put in his oar, and T. Emmett Clary was also appointed.
Right. Now, once again, if you could just tell the youngsters who John Bailey was.
John Bailey was the Democratic National Chairman. He was also the Democratic State Chairman. And he was one of the first people to support John F. Kennedy to be President of the United States. He supported him, and sure enough, when Kennedy was elected, John Bailey became national chairman of the Democratic Party. And that was, I mean, you had clout when you were a Democratic chairman, national Democratic chairman. And when I started, there were, Judge Timbers was down in New Haven, and Judges Clary and Blumenfeld were up in Hartford. And what had occurred was, as the Eisenhower administration wound down between 1958 and 1960, which was the election year, assistant U.S. attorneys were looking for other appointments, because if the Republicans won, they weren't going to be reappointed. It was all political back in the early 60s. And what they did is, if the Republicans lost, they were not going to be reappointed. So what occurred was, they were all looking, and finally there was either one or two people left in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they couldn't handle the whole state. Well, Kennedy won, appointed Bob Zampano, but he didn't appoint him immediately, so he needed what was called a judicial appointment. And the U.S. district judges got together and appointed Robert C. Zampano, subject to senatorial approval, and that's exactly what happened.
So this is 7 years. He's 7 years out of law school, Bob Zampano, when he's getting.
No, he was appointed U.S. district. He was appointed assistant U.S. That's right. He was 7 years out of law school, and he had been executive secretary of the Sentence Review Commission. He was the Democratic chairman of East Haven, and he was also one of the early supporters of John Kennedy. And after he became U.S. attorney, apparently John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had all the U.S. attorneys who had been appointed down to the White House for a kind of a picnic. And Bob Zampano said that Robert Kennedy, who was kind of he was a football player, what he did is they were playing touch football on the White House lawn. And he was saying that it started where Kennedy turned to somebody and he went like that. That was the signal that they were going to be playing some touch football. And they were all young appointees, and it was just great. In my office, I have my certificate of appointment up with my diplomas, and my kids. The only one of my son has a picture of me being sworn in. My daughter has a picture of me being sworn in as Assistant U.S. Attorney. My son wants the certificate. It's signed by Robert F. Kennedy and Byron White, who became a Supreme Court Justice. He was Whizzer White, Colorado University class of 1937. Anyway, after I left the U.S. Attorney's Office in '63, I became associated with Abraham S. Ullman, who had just retired from the State's Attorney's Office. Ab Ullman had been appointed in 1928, and he was Assistant U.S. Attorney, he was Assistant State's Attorney, and then he became State's Attorney. And that was back in the days when it wasn't a full-time job. And he was, I think he was one of the most respected lawyers and one of the most respected men. And he was a fabulous person.
Now, I've heard lots of stories about the relationship between my grandfather, Israel Jacobs, and Ab Ullman.
Were they true? Probably. One day we were going to, your grandfather loved trying cases. Your grandfather was as pugnacious a litigator as God ever created. And we were going to lunch one day from the federal courthouse. We used to have lunch at the Court Restaurant, which was at the corner of Court Street and State Street. And there was a family that made just the greatest Italian food. And we used to go down there for lunch. And as we were walking down there on the south side of Court Street, leaving the courthouse, your grandfather and I think one of your uncles walk across the street, and your grandfather was berating Bob Zampano because of something that William Timbers had done when he was judge. Bob looked at him and he says, "Izzy," he says, "I didn't have anything to do with the ruling." I mean, it was, your grandfather they tell apocryphal stories about him. At the Bar Association picnics, he was a great pinochle player. And they used to have every year the Izzy Jacobs Memorial Pinochle game, where some of the older lawyers used to play pinochle. And he was there. They used to play the dark. I mean, he was a marvelous guy. Yeah. He was a character, but he was great. He was a good lawyer. You could always trust his word. I know one time he, I don't know whether or not you're going to edit this out, but this is interesting. A woman came in to see us in a domestic matter involving her former husband. And your grandfather had represented her former husband. And he started to represent the woman against his former client. And she came in to see us, and I went, I didn't think it was completely proper. And one of my dearest and closest friends was the former Chief Justice Patrick B. O'Sullivan. I loved him, and he was a state referee at that time. And I came in and I was just beside myself. And he said, what's your problem? And I explained what had happened. He said to me, and this, I'll never forget his gesture. He says, "Oh, that was Izzy. Don't get too excited about it." And it was just a, I mean, we ended up representing a woman. I don't even remember whether or not he represented a husband, but it was, he was what you would call a character, but a good, dear character. When he had his offices in 157 Church Street, and he was a good man. Anyway, Ab had an associate by the name of Irving, and they used to have offices in the Union and New Haven Trust Company building, 205 Church Street. And Irving had a son who was a doctor, and he died very tragically of cancer. And I guess Irving just had no more spirit to practice law, so he left. And Ab said, "Look, I got a room if you want to practice with me." He charged me. We weren't in any way associated, but if he had things like short calendar that he had to answer, I'd go for him. And then on January 1st, 1964, we became partners. It was me and Ab, and Ab's son, Andy, was in his last year at Yale Law School, and he was going to be coming in to the practice with us. And eventually the three of us became partners. And Ab was our partner until August 20th, 1974. And that was the day he had a stroke or a heart attack in the office, and he passed away in the office. He died doing what he loved doing best. He loved practicing law, and he passed away right in the office there. And Andy and I, Andy, we've been together, we were together for 52 years. We said, we're going to stay together, and we did. And then several years later, Gary Sclaver came with us. And he was with us for a while, and then he went out and he's practicing with Judge LeCarry's son. And I decided this year that I'm going to be 87. I was 87 on June 5th. This might be a good time to retire. And one of the reasons I retired was because of the telephone call. I'm moving to Sarasota. My wife had a first cousin who was widowed 3 years ago. I was widowed 8 years ago. And my middle daughter said to me, "Did you call Myra to wish her a happy birthday?" I said, "I didn't know it was her birthday." So I called her, and she said, "What's the weather like up in New Haven?" And this was back 2 years ago. Remember the snowstorms in February? I said, "You really don't want to know what it's like here." She said, "The weather in Sarasota is beautiful." I said, my next reservation is on Sarasota. And since then, we've been seeing each other. And I want to move down to Sarasota. And that's essentially, that was my legal career. And one of the reasons why I stayed in the practice of law so long was because I loved it so much. I loved the people I knew. I'll tell you about some of the people that I knew. Most of the people I knew, as Bob Zampano would say, his word was his bond. In other words, we used to bewail the fact that sometimes, you'd make an agreement with a lawyer and all of a sudden it would blow up. And one of the things that our office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and my law office prided ourselves on was the fact that you make a deal, you stick to the deal. It may kill you, but you stick to the deal. And back in 1983, George Tiernan, who was the former state's attorney, passed away, and he was secretary of the Bar Examining Committee. And Judge Fracas called me in one day, and he says, there's a vacancy on the Bar Examining Committee. I'm putting your name in. He said, would you do it? I said, sure. and I was secretary of the Bar Examining Committee from 1983 until April 30th of this year. And my wife, my late wife, used to call it my Friday morning play group, because that was really a great group. At the time I was appointed, Gerson Silverberg of Norwich was the chairman, and I came to the first meeting, and he said, "You know, George Tiernan was the secretary." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You're the new secretary." I said, "What am I supposed to do?" He says, "Be a secretary." And since then, I was a secretary. I enjoyed it very much. And there were three chairs that I served under. One chair was Gerson Silverberg, one chair was Ray Beckwith, and then the present chair, who was Anne Dranginis, who was a former appellate court judge. But it was just we spent a lot of time in the Bar Examining Committee trying to do the right thing. And really, there was litigation involved. And what we tried to do was, we said, by admitting somebody to the bar, are we putting the residents of the state of Connecticut in any compromised or dangerous position by letting so-and-so in? Because there are things in his background, or her background, that really make you wonder whether or not that person is going to be an honest lawyer who does the job that a lawyer should do. Anyway, that was one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done. And I was also on a selection committee appointed by the Second Circuit for the appointment of not the present bankruptcy judge, but the prior bankruptcy judge in New Haven, Judge Weil. And that was also a kind of a very important thing that we did. It was we had a group of about 12, and what we would do is we would look over the applications, and there was like 43 original applications, and we sweated it down to 12, and then we interviewed every one of the applicants, and then we sweated it down to 3, and everyone that we recommended to the Second Circuit for appointment as bankruptcy judge was I thought any one of them could have been appointed.
Well, it was a fine choice, if I may say.
Judge Weil?
Judge Weil was a wonderful lady.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think that
that's
the universal opinion about her.
Yeah, I met her. She was, she passed away, and I met her husband at there was I think a memorial. I don't think. Yeah, there was a memorial meeting that your father had put together, and she was one of the persons. And I met her husband for the first time, and I could really see how. She was really a fine person. One of the stories I got to tell you is, I have 3 children, and Rabbi Skolnick at her funeral said that my wife Marcia had hit the Jewish mother's trifecta: 2 lawyers and a doctor. And we had gone down to, my oldest daughter Willa she does mining and safety law in DC, and right now she's getting ready to move out to Portland, Oregon. She's got a job with a firm out there. The coal mining industry, as you know, is kind of going downhill, and her firm represented a huge number of coal miners and coal mining firms, and she's going out to the West Coast to do strictly mining law. Anyway,
what about Adam?
I'm sorry?
What does Adam do?
Well, Adam does criminal defense work in New York. Adam is on 2 panels for the Second Circuit. One panel is to represent accused terrorists. And he just came back from an assignment, and I'm not going to tell you where, of course he asked me not to say it to anybody. He was 2.5 weeks and investigating a case. And the second one was the capital crimes panel. You know, the federal government has not stopped capital punishment. And he had a case in Brooklyn. He practices in the Second Circuit. And one of the cases he had was a drive-by representing a man who had been accused in a drive-by shooting. And one of the victims was a nun. And his opposing counsel was a young man by the name of Mo Fodeman. And Mo, they used to, similar to your father, to your grandfather, he used to fight like hell with Mo Fodeman during the course. Then he used to go out to lunch together. And one day he said to Mo, where did you go to school? He says, well, he says, I lived in Westport, he says, but I went to the school in New Haven called Hopkins. And Adam said, I went to Hopkins. And they were like 5 or 6 years apart, so that they really didn't know each other. The headmistress of Hopkins, Mrs. Ryan,
Riley,
got a hold of these 2 lawyers, and she said, how would you like to address an assembly and tell the kids what you do? And he said, well, what are we going to talk about? She said, well, why don't you give the final arguments that you gave in the course of the trial? The result with Adam was his client was not, he wasn't given the death penalty, which is all really Adam wanted to do, make sure that he didn't get the death penalty. So they said, sure. And Adam invited me on a Friday morning to go to an assembly at Hopkins. And each of them explained what they did, and each of them gave a part of their final argument. And after it was over, I went over to Mrs. Ryan and I said to her, gee, thanks for having me. And she says, no, she says, thanks for raising your kids this way. And I said, well, I enjoyed it. She says, well, I got a problem now. I said, what's your problem? She said, I got 400 kids who wanting to ask 800 questions. And it was really, anyway, and he stayed friendly with Mo Fodeman. Not only is my son a lawyer, but is also a sailor. He just finished this past summer a transatlantic sailing race where they came in first from Newport to England, to the Isle of Wight in England.
wow.
Anyway, my son, he graduated Hopkins and he started in Skidmore. And he wasn't the greatest student at Hopkins, but he went to Skidmore and all of a sudden he was a young genius. And he was on the dean's list. And I said to him, Adam, how come, you weren't the greatest student at Hopkins, and all of a sudden? He says, after Hopkins, I could do Skidmore standing on my ear. So I said to him, well, all right, you're not going to, I think you ought to transfer. Well, I graduated Columbia, and I said, why don't you apply to Columbia? He said, I'll never get in. I said, well, apply anyway. So he applied, and one Saturday morning, I was coming back from synagogue, and there's a letter from Columbia. And it was a skinny letter, and normally what happens with a skinny letter, it's a refusal. I open it up and it says, welcome to the class of 1987. Well, he was up in Boston practicing for the America's Cup race in Walter Cronkite's boat. And he said, if we qualify, I'm going to be going to Perth, Australia. I said, do you know where Perth is? He said, I know where it is. I said, it's halfway around the world. Anyway, so I see the letter, and I call him on the phone. I can't get him right away. And finally, around 5 o'clock, he calls me back. And I said, Adam, you got into Columbia as a transfer student. He said, well, I don't know whether or not I want to go there. And I said, you stay where you are. I'm going to come up and kill you. Anyway, he transferred to Columbia, and then he ended up going to Wisconsin Law